In this episode, I will try to explain to you a very, very important concept you need to understand if you want to use eramba for compliance and risk. And that is the problem versus solution principle. This is kind of the way eramba does GRC. As you know, GRC is a management practice. It's a bit like sales or marketing. Everyone does it in a different way, and that's perfectly fine. There's not one way to do GRC. Now, eramba has its own way of doing GRC, and what I'm trying to do in this episode is explain to you how that works. Now, roughly speaking, eramba, when it comes to risk and compliance, groups modules into two things, something we call problems and solutions. The idea in eramba is that you start implementing the software on the problem side. On the problem side, we have the risk module, the compliance module, and the data privacy module. For us, these things are problems. So if you are implementing eramba and you're doing risk compliance, you might have had here 100 risks, and in compliance you'll have NIST and ISO and God knows what else. And then on data privacy, when you're managing data flows, you will have 100 flows in here. So in the end, you can easily accumulate here hundreds, if not thousands of problems. Now, the first principle in eramba, and this is a very important thing you need to understand, the first principle in eramba says something like, for every one of these problems, you need to tell eramba what solutions you have. The best way for it to explain this to you will be using examples. So let's assume that you want to do compliance in eramba. When you're doing compliance in eramba, you're basically uploading this set of problems in this module, which we call compliance packages. Here's where you upload all these different frameworks. And then for every one of these problems, for every one of the items on these frameworks, you need to describe what solutions you have. And you do that here on compliance analysis. You see here I have, ISO 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. Now the way you implement eramba, let me go here. We are back here, right down here in the compliance module. We are looking at the ISO requirements, where the first principle says that we need to read the problem. And once we read the problem, we need to tell eramba what solutions we have. And when it comes to solutions, we have these four options. When the problem, it doesn't matter if it's a risk, compliance, or data privacy, when the problem requires you a paper, then the solution will be here in the policy module. In this module is where you store all your documents like templates, policies, procedures, contracts, whatever resembles a piece of paper goes in here. If you have a problem and the problem requires an activity, so for example, you have a risk that laptops can be lost or stolen, and that problem requires an activity like encrypting laptops or making strong authentication, then that will be a control. In eramba, this thing here, internal controls, are activities, things that people do in your company. Encrypting a laptop requires doing something and therefore is an internal control. And then if you have a problem here for which you do not have a solution, so you don't have these two things, in eramba you have exceptions and pushbacks. If you have a problem, you don't have the solution, and no one in your company wants to do anything about that problem, then you will link the exception to the problem. The exception has the title, somewhere that says, well, it is what it is, and a deadline. If you have a problem for which you don't have a solution, but your company wants to do something in the future, then you can create a project in eramba. And again, the project will be like a promise that you will do something someday. Now let's go back here. We are in the compliance module, so we are down here. We read we have a problem, policies for information security. So this is the problem. Now the requirement is asking for a piece of paper. So as you can see here, we want to say that we want to do something about this, and the solution for this is a policy called information security policy. So what happened here is that someone went to the policy module here, they upload that solution. So in the policy module, they upload that solution. So they went up here, they upload that policy, and then once that policy was there, they come here, they go to edit, they search the policy from the policy module, and they associate. And as you can see now, we have a problem, and for this problem, we know that the solution is a policy. Now this problem here from ISO, it also says that these policies must be made public and explained to people around the organization. So if you want to do all that, you see you need an activity. We have the compliance requirement here, we link that policy, but you see the requirement, the problem also is asking for awareness. So we will create a control in here that describes how we do awareness programs in the organization, and we will link that internal control to this compliance requirement. So again, same story. We see under internal control, we have a control. If we go here, we go to internal controls. Here's where someone created a control, so we have many controls. you will create the control in here, and once the control is there, again, you just simply edit that cell and you associate the solution to that requirement. By the way, you could link 5 or 6 solutions. It doesn't have to be one, of course. Yes. Now, why we do this? Because if someone asks me what problems we have, I can easily explain what problems we have. If someone says what solution we have for this or that problem, all I have to do is follow the arrows upwards, wherever that take me, that will be the solution for this given problem. If someone also says, why do we need the security policy? I just take the policy and I follow the arrows downwards, whatever it takes. So what we're trying to explain here is we start with problems and then solutions. For the example, I just gave you compliance, but the same applies to risk management. If I go to the risk module and I have a risk, which is that laptops can be lost or stolen. As you can see, the solution for this risk apparently is a control, which is called endpoint reviews. So we are doing endpoint reviews of the laptops, and we have a policy, which is the IT security policy. So back here, we have a risk here, which is linked to a control, and a risk, which is linked to a policy. Now, it's important to understand that the solutions up here will be leveraged many, many times down here. The typical leverage in the community is 5 to 15. What that means is if you have 1,000 problems, you do not need 1,000 solutions. You will need maybe 100. I'm sure we can see it here. Look, if I take this control here, endpoint reviews, if I'm going to access that control, and I will pull a basic report of that control, you see this control, so we are looking at control up here. This control, endpoint reviews, has 2 policies linked to it, inventory of assets and IT security policy, so the control is linked to 2 policies. And from a risk perspective, this control is mitigating 2 asset risks, this and this one. And from a compliance perspective, this control you see is doing many things in ISO, in NIST, in CIS. You see the leverage for this particular control is very high because it's dealing with multiple problems at the same time. So remember, these solutions here will be used multiple times down here. Now, when you're able to explain the problems and the solutions you have, that's great. It simplifies things a lot for your C-level executives that they don't really understand all this terminology, and things become far more accessible. The problem is when you tell people that you have solutions, they sort of think that the problem no longer exists because you said you have a solution. But that's not entirely true because, as we know, these solutions might be working, might not be working, might be outdated, God knows what happens to them. For that reason, in eramba, we have something we call the second principle. The second principle is incredibly important. When you create a policy, or when you create an exception, or when you create a project, there's always going to be a deadline. On this deadline, you need to do something. And if you don't do something, that thing will become yellow. And whatever this thing touches down below will also become yellow. So your problems inherit the status of your solutions. Let's see if we can find an example here. Here we have, for example, that this risk in here is mitigated by this control and by this policy. You see, the policy is okay, but the control failed the last audit. So that means that this control here failed the last audit. Now, because this control failed the last audit, we no longer are mitigating the risk. You see, there's a conflict in between these 2 statements. And therefore, the summary of this risk is that the control last audit failed. The status column is the one that shows you all the time how things are going on. That's the very, very key column. You see, in this case, this risk is saying control last audit expired. So this risk in here surely has a control, this one here, but it's expired. This one here is what is expired, failed. If I go to compliance, it's exactly the same story. We just go to compliance analysis, so we see the same examples. So if I have ISO, this requirement here, you see the status control last audit expired. This control here has 2 controls, both of them are expired because these 2 things are yellow. This compliance requirement is yellow. This one here is red. I'm sure there's an audit failed there. So as you see, the status column is the one that kind of highlights how compliant or not you are. These status are highly customizable, so here you can define any kind of status you want and any kind of inheritance you want. There's a million possibilities in this regard. The point here is that these statuses are the ones you're looking at to know whether your solutions are actually working. And you can tell that by looking at both sides. You can look at the solution or at the problem and you will still see that status. Hopefully you have understood how the problems and solution principle works. It's very, very important you understand this if you want to use eramba. Please stay in touch. See you later.